Good morning, Sherry. How are you?
I'm great, Beth. Thank you so much for providing this opportunity. I love that we're getting to know all our members.
It's awesome. So this is Sherry MacKay. And Sherry, how long have you been a member of RCIS?
Since RCS, I believe since it started, I've been a TESOL member, and when I saw that there was an intersection for the refugee concerns intersection, I signed up immediately. So I don't know, when did it start? 10 years ago or so?
I'm not even sure.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
No. So my name is Beth.
Not that long, yeah.
Chair of Refugee Concerns, and we're having this little tete-a-tete just to kind of get to know people who are in the organization so that we can make connections. So Sherry, the first question I'm going to ask you is, can you introduce yourself a little bit, tell us what you're all about, and why are you connected to RCIS?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Beth. So my background in ESL has almost always been with adults. And I started in Toronto, Canada. Across Canada, there's a huge program, language instruction for newcomers, LINK, and I taught new immigrants and refugees. It was like 5 days a week, 5 hours a day. And I had students like literally from every part of the globe in my one classroom, which is not always the case, right? Depending on your neighborhood, but I had a very diverse neighborhood. So that's where I started. And should I continue on from here?
Yeah,
So I'll say, like, as I said, I was teaching like 25 hours a week. You know, they just had one teacher, which is a lot. And the one thing I learned early on, the one kind of theory that I applied to everything was around the affective filter, Krashen's affective filter, and just really how important it was to make sure the students felt at ease, and also to be mindful. Like, I had students who, after lunch, some of them were on medication, right, for PTSD. And so I introduced a lot of games in my classroom and a lot of cooperative learning. And then we moved to Riverside, California, which is in Southern California. And here for a number of years, I worked for UC Riverside in international education programs. And then in 2012, we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this was pardon me?
I said that's quite a switch. I mean,
It is quite a
the
switch.
populations that you must have had going from Canada to Riverside to New Mexico.
Correct. Yeah, and in Riverside, I did some adult ed of the community where I was teaching predominantly, actually almost all Mexican women. We were going to the schools and teaching the parents. And then in Albuquerque, I got involved with a study called the Refugee Wellbeing Project. And this study's gone on for a number of years. And essentially, it's Dr. Jessica Goodkind is the lead professor in sociology, and students commit to 2 quarters of study, and they learn about the countries where families being resettled are coming from. So in that time, they were coming from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Democratic Republic of Congo. So the students would learn about those countries, and then eventually they were partnered up with new families, and they were their advocates. But obviously, there's this really beautiful kind of reciprocal exchange, cultural exchange between these young college students and these newcomers. And for me, that's when I really learned about the resettlement process in the US, and admittedly, really how little support new refugees get. And of course, it also depends on where they're being resettled and what organizations are in place. But from the government's standpoint, it's 3 months. But through this program, they had something once a week called the Learning Circle, where the undergrads and the families, we would be in a circle, and we had interpreters, and we'd have different topics. So healthcare, disciplining your children in the US, all kind of whatever. And really, it came from them. What did they want to talk about? And it's a really amazing model. And I would love to see it like in every city, because it's so good, as I said, for obviously these refugee families. And then, because they need as much, all the support they can get. But also
it's also helpful for the volunteers that they actually get to know a little bit about people's backgrounds, because I think altogether too often people have that good intention of setting somebody up with a volunteer, but the volunteer really doesn't know anything about the family that they're supposed to be trying to help.
No, exactly. And so there was a lot of support for the students in supporting the families, and I was supporting them around teaching English and supporting the adults who needed that. and getting them into local programs. So I loved this model. I love this program. And then in 2015, I moved back to Riverside. And one of my best friends, Celine Nielsen Yildiz, who had been in, so I met her in Riverside, but then she moved to Des Moines, and then she was in Turkey, working at a university, but very close to the border of Syria. And it was a time when basically all the Syrians were, fleeing to Turkey. She got involved with a large refugee camp. So she had been working with refugees. I'd been working with refugees. We moved back to Riverside. Are there refugees here? What's happening? And soon enough, we learned that there were refugees here. California historically is a resettlement state, and they've always resettled a lot, more along the coast. And so along the coast, the Bay Area and LA and San Diego, you have a lot of resettlement organizations and other organizations, nonprofits, supporting the newcomers. Here in Riverside, we had one resettlement organization, but soon we learned that resettlement organizations from LA and Orange County were resettling families out here because it was more affordable, or they had family members out here.
Mm-hmm.
But just because of the distance, they were really not giving them any support.
Yeah.
So we started an organization, Celine and myself, locally connected. And I started with a class with 4 Afghan women. And the issues for them not going to the local adult schools was either in this city here, the adult school, you need to have some basic literacy skills. And 2 of the women didn't have that. They don't provide childcare. And then here, public transportation is not ideal, to say the least. So I just enlisted some friends to volunteer, and we met in a church that had a childcare facility, and we had volunteers working with the children and driving the women to class, and then also helping me in the class when we would divide into groups based on level.
Were the children getting ESL services as well, sort of?
Well, they were babies and toddlers.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely they were, the volunteers would, sing with them and play with them, and they didn't know the language, so of course they were speaking to them in English.
And I love that name, Locally Connected. Can you tell me where that came from?
Yeah, we just kind of were brainstorming what we were about, and Celine, her heart was really in Turkey, and still is, what's happening there, and I was kind of more focused here locally, and we're just talking what's really the importance in anything. It's connection. So we became locally connected.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, so actually, the local is a word in the Urban Dictionary, but so
really,
yeah, the Urban Dictionary. So it's a newer term, but it definitely suited what we were doing. So with the ESL class, it started to grow because it was basically word of mouth. Mm-hmm. And so we were also enlisting volunteers. So for me, our program would not have happened without our volunteers. So I'm a strong proponent of engaging volunteers.
How did you go through the process of, so I know that oftentimes with volunteers, you get people who have really good hearts, but really don't know what they're doing. So how did you deal with that side of it, making sure that your volunteers were trained enough to be able to do the work that you were trying to do? Right.
So admittedly, the beginning, there wasn't a lot of training because we were just kind of growing naturally. Mm-hmm. Like I said, 4 women, these 4 women in my class were teaching English. And then it grew to at times we had 28, 30 students in our class. But on average, it was always around 12, 15 women. Eventually, over time, we were training them. But at the beginning, it was kind of I just spent a lot of time talking with them and modeling for them and really talking to them about what they were passionate about. So this one woman who was retired, she had an elderly mother that she had to care for. So she would go pick up the women in the next city, drive them here, drop them off, go spend time with her mom, come back, pick them up and drive them. And she told me after, she's I always knew I was going to drive, but I just never knew I would love. And she got teary-eyed because she just talked about how these women would invite her into their home after and want to share a cup of tea and have lunch with them. And so as our program grew, and I kind of thought as a teacher, I needed to kind of set some boundaries because often in this field, we're compassionate people and we want to support our learners. But I also knew, you go into one person's home, you've got to go into everyone's home. But having the volunteers do that, and I would always do things like more like on the weekend, if there was something with the whole community, I would participate. But once the program started growing, I was kind of cautious to go into everyone's home because it just, there's like people think there's
Yeah.
favoritism or whatever it may be.
And that line's really hard to draw because they won't learn from you unless they know you. And yet, you still have to maintain that kind of professional line.
It's a very fine line, and it's really important because, like what you said, I'll say especially with the women that I was working with, like trust is imperative. That they trust you and that they feel safe, and that's even all around trauma. It affects our body, right? We need to feel safe. So that was really important for me, that the women felt safe and secure and that they trusted me. And in them trusting me, I had to make sure that I really brought in the right volunteers, right? So also, like, I would kind of do my own screening process and bringing volunteers, understanding, I would say, their intentions, and talking about things like, religion, right? Okay, if it was somebody coming from potentially a Christian background, just talking to them about how these women have their own faith and we're not about proselytizing. We're here to respect each other. So we never had any issues around that. But yeah, so through this, really a community built. And the other thing I just want to talk about is that we always started every class in a circle. And I had women in the class that had never gone to school a day in their lives. I had another woman in the class who was a director. She started actually her own private school in Kabul. Mm-hmm. So we had the full range of, within a country, there's different cultures and different educational backgrounds and just experiences in life. Yeah. But we always started together in a circle. And it was a time sometimes just to share, but it was a time that we came together as a community. And also that time, so for me, what became really imperative, like with Locally Connected, was this idea of building community. So building community in the classroom. And then eventually that community, once they felt really safe, we were able to connect them to the larger community. Mm-hmm. And so that was like, we would participate in different craft sales, and they became like entrepreneurs, and they were making jewelry or selling food. Awesome. But also this other, pardon me?
It really empowers them and gives them,
without a doubt,
those feet to stand on.
It was incredibly empowering. Like, I just think of this, for some of the women, they needed any extra money, right? But I remember this, and I mean, they all did, but there was this one, I'll say older woman, who had never worked a day in her life. And she sold some baklava, and she's looking at me like teary-eyed, saying like, this is the first money that she ever made herself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so awesome.
So it's just like suddenly you go, oh yeah, and you're like, oh my gosh, right? She's always been completely dependent on her husband and then, her grown children to support her.
Yeah.
And she just was, anyway, she was so proud and felt, empowered.
Awesome. So there are just a ton of stories in here that I want to pull out of you, but we're reaching the end of our time. And so all of this work that you did there brought you to where you are, to your next project that you're working on now. So can you just quickly fill us in on where you're headed to at this moment?
Right. So with Globally Connected, what I learned in the classroom is that there's a lot. Actually, there's a lot for a teacher. I mean, it's not a lot. I don't want to say that in a heavy way, but we have to wear many hats. And the reality is that I found that these women could not. It was very difficult for them to just walk into a classroom and start learning. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I started doing is I brought a psychiatrist in once a month, and she was teaching us about trauma, how it impacts the brain, and then giving strategies on how to cope with stress using mindfulness. And actually, it was part of a study called we did this resiliency scale to, one, show the women how resilient they are, what they're already doing, but then to give them additional strategies. but this is something, I mean, I was never taught, right? So like when you're teaching adults, we're talking about themes like housing, family. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. I mean,
yeah,
often like this really stirs up a lot of emotions. It triggers a lot of like sadness. And so, I had, most adults, I don't know, at least in my case, I've had students in the past that, were crying in class or that could get really angry in class. And, I kind of, let's say, dealt with it the best way I could at the time. And
no,
actually, in my case, some of my I had a volunteer who I had volunteers that were wonderful, like so a retired marriage and family therapist, somebody else who worked in special needs. So I had a lot of support in the class through the volunteers. But in saying that, I started another initiative called Transformational Learning Communities, and it's all around trauma sensitive learning environments and how to support teachers.
Mhm.
And so I'm working with two therapists, and this is kind of a new initiative. So I don't have a website up yet. We started a Facebook group that's going to evolve, but at this point it's ESL with TLC.
Mhm.
But really, it's going to eventually just become TLC, Transformational Learning Communities. And the idea is, I don't know, I want to build a community for teachers
Mhm.
to come together, to learn best, to share best practices, to learn from one another, and how we can make our classes trauma informed.
Just beautiful.
So that's kind of
So
where I'm
lovely.
at.
Yeah. So, what's the best place for people to reach you? Is it that website, or is it another way if they were interested in learning more about this project?
Right. So as I said, I don't have the website up yet. That's a work in progress. We have a Facebook group,
Facebook. Yeah,
ESL with TLC, and then they can email me also, ESL with TLC, all lower cap, at gmail.com.
that's
I'd
so.
be happy to talk to anyone. And I know there are a lot of people in this community, like you interviewed Brenda and her and Judith O'Loughlin. Actually, they've written, it's back there on my bookshelf, a great book on trauma sensitive learning environments. And I know they have more background in K through 12, but a lot of this can apply to all levels.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have a really strong community here.
I'm so excited about the work that you're doing, and I can't wait to see where it goes. Thank you so much, Sherry, for taking time out of your day to talk to me.
Of
And
course.
yeah, and I hope that things go really well for you in your new endeavors. And yeah, and we expect to hear more from you.
Definitely. I look forward to hopefully seeing people at TESOL in Pittsburgh, or the Lesla conference. I think is going to be maybe virtual this year, but anyway.
Mhm.
Um,
That's awesome.
but here
Okay.
at RCS. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Sherry. It was good talking
Okay.
to you.